The drive to Ashford Manor took no more than 5 minutes, though to those crammed into Dr. Graves's motor car and the police constable's vehicle that had arrived with remarkable speed from the neighbouring town, it felt considerably longer. Miss Marple had managed to secure a seat in the doctor's car through the simple expedience of being older than most of the other committee members, and therefore somehow deserving of consideration, a courtesy that few people questioned despite her obvious ability to walk the distance without undue difficulty. As they wound up the tree-lined drive that led to the manor, she observed the grounds with the meticulous attention of someone cataloguing a particularly complex piece of needlework. The autumn leaves had begun their descent in earnest, creating a carpet of amber and rust across the manicured lawn, and she noticed that the leaves beneath the library window on the eastern side of the manor were disturbed in a manner that seemed both too extensive and somehow too deliberately arranged, as though someone had taken pains to ensure that the disorder appeared natural rather than occurring through the simple accident of falling objects and broken branches. Constable Hartley, a competent if unimaginative man in his mid-50s who had served St. Mary's for the past 18 years, with a record of minor traffic infractions and the occasional livestock dispute, was already issuing instructions to the gathered staff members who had assembled on the gravel drive, their faces bearing the peculiar expression of those who have been startled from their ordinary routines by something that fell decidedly outside the bounds of normal village experience. Jonathan Ashford's body lay on the flagstone terrace directly beneath the library window, covered with a crisp white sheet that someone had thought to fetch from the linen cupboard, though not before several of the younger servants had glimpsed the reality of his final position. What Miss Marple could discern from her vantage point suggested several interesting contradictions to the narrative that Charles Pemberton had so urgently presented. The body lay at an angle that suggested someone falling from a considerable height might land differently, and the scatter of broken glass and twisted metal from what appeared to be a reading lamp lay in a pattern that seemed inconsistent with the position of the library window directly above. Dr. Graves, having knelt beside the body for a preliminary examination, confirmed what most of them had already deduced. Jonathan Ashford was indeed dead, the fall having resulted in injuries that would have rendered consciousness impossible, though the doctor's expression suggested he was cataloguing details that went beyond the obvious. Constable Hartley began his initial inquiries with the methodical approach of someone following a well-established protocol, though Miss Marple suspected that his training had not adequately prepared him for a case that might prove considerably more complex than a straightforward accident. Charles Pemberton provided his account with admirable consistency, explaining that he had come to the manor to discuss the next day's festival preparations and to ensure that Jonathan had all the arrangements he required for his speech. Upon entering the library, he had discovered his employer on the terrace below and had immediately rushed to summon help, a narrative that was corroborated by his flushed appearance and apparent state of shock, yet which contained several small elements that caused Miss Marple's carefully cultivated suspicions to bloom like flowers in spring. Margaret Ashford had been resting in her room and claimed to have heard nothing unusual, a statement that seemed oddly implausible given that the library lay directly adjacent to her suite of rooms, and that a fall from such a height would surely produce some sound. Eleanor Pemberton, for she had introduced herself with her married name, had been in the garden room on the opposite side of the manor, arranging flowers for the festival, and had only learned of the tragedy when Charles had raised the alarm through the household. The household staff offered various accounts of their activities during the relevant time, and Miss Marple listened to each with the patient attention of someone who understood that truth often resided not in what people said, but in what their choices of words and expressions revealed about the circumstances they were describing. The library itself, when Constable Hartley permitted the assembled group a brief observation, presented a scene that troubled Miss Marple considerably. The window from which Jonathan had allegedly fallen stood open, and the library beyond appeared to be in perfect order, with no signs of struggle or disturbance that one might expect from someone who had lost their footing and fallen through an open window. Jonathan's reading chair sat beside a table where a half-finished cup of tea had gone cold, and beside it lay an open book of architectural drawings as though he had been engaged in pleasant contemplation of his own work when accident had struck. Yet the more Miss Marple studied the scene, the more convinced she became that what had occurred in this room was no simple accident, but rather a carefully constructed performance designed to appear as though it were. The angle of the body, the position of the lamp, the placement of the debris, and most tellingly, the absolute absence of the kind of chaotic disturbance that must surely accompany a violent and unexpected fall, all suggested that someone with considerable forethought and knowledge of human nature had orchestrated this tragedy with the meticulous precision of a conductor leading an orchestra. As Constable Hartley began to corral statements from the household and estate workers, and as Dr. Graves consulted quietly with the police surgeon who had arrived from the town to undertake a preliminary examination, Miss Marple moved quietly through the grounds, her small figure drawing little notice as she observed the flower beds, the gravel paths, and the relationships between distances and sightlines, with the patient focus of someone who understood that sometimes the most important evidence was not what one saw, but what one's observations revealed about what others had failed to notice. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western hills, casting long shadows across the terrace, and in those shadows Miss Marple perceived the first genuine outline of a truth that most of the village would not begin to suspect for several days yet. By the time the evening shadows had begun to settle across the grounds of Ashford Manor, transforming the manicured gardens into a landscape of indistinct shapes and mysterious contours, Constable Hartley had made the preliminary determination that the death of Jonathan Ashford appeared to be accidental, a conclusion that seemed to bring a palpable sense of relief to the assembled household and the village representatives who had gathered in the drawing-room. The constable, having completed his initial observations and taken statements from all parties, had pronounced himself satisfied that the available evidence supported Charles Pemberton's account and that the matter could be referred to the coroner for a formal inquest, a process that would most certainly result in a verdict of accidental death and allow the village to proceed with the elaborate machinery of mourning and funeral arrangements. Yet Miss Marple, ensconced in a chintz armchair near the fireplace with a cup of tea that she had accepted from Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper noticed that Dr. Graves had not entirely accepted this conclusion with the same ease as the constable. The doctor stood near the window, his arms crossed in a manner suggesting internal debate, and his eyes kept returning to Miss Marple herself, as though he were uncertain whether to voice certain observations to a woman whom he had known for many years, but whose true capabilities and insights he had perhaps never fully appreciated. It was Eleanor who broke the careful silence that had settled over the drawing-room, her voice emerging thin and somewhat strained as she addressed a question that most people would have found uncomfortable to articulate. "I wonder," she said, looking directly at Constable Hartley with an intensity that suggested she had been considering this matter for some time, "whether anyone has examined Jonathan's study thoroughly. He was arranging his personal papers yesterday evening. He mentioned to me that he had found something in the estate records that had rather disturbed him, something to do with the manor's history during the war years." The statement hung in the air with the weight of a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that seemed to expand outward through the gathered company in a manner that suggested Eleanor had introduced an element of uncertainty where the constable had been preparing to close the matter definitively. Constable Hartley's expression shifted from settled satisfaction to renewed wariness, and even Charles Pemberton, who had been standing quietly near the door with the bearing of someone relieved that his initial panic had been vindicated by official judgment, straightened with visible tension. Margaret Ashford's face, which had maintained an expression of distant grief appropriate to a sister who had lost a brother to misadventure, flickered with something more complicated. A recognition perhaps that Eleanor's mention of Jonathan's research into the manor's wartime history had introduced a complication that none of them had anticipated. Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care, a gesture that seemed to draw everyone's attention despite its quietness, and she turned her head toward Eleanor with the expression of mild interest one might adopt when encountering an interesting piece of information during afternoon conversation. "How very observant of you, dear," she remarked, her voice carrying the gentle warmth of age and long experience. Most people would not have noticed that Mr. Ashford had been preoccupied with something beyond the ordinary pleasures of retirement. I confess I had observed that he seemed somewhat less celebratory than one might expect from a man preparing to receive the village's recognition and gratitude. This simple statement, which appeared to be nothing more than the idle observation of an elderly woman, seemed to produce a curious effect upon the assembled company. Eleanor's shoulders relaxed slightly, as though she had been uncertain of her ground and had now received unexpected validation, while Margaret's expression hardened into something more defensive, and Charles Pemberton's hand moved to his collar in a gesture of nervousness. Dr. Graves stepped forward with renewed purpose, addressing Constable Hartley with the authority of a man accustomed to being taken seriously in matters of medical significance. "I think, Hartley," the doctor said, his voice carrying a weight of professional concern, "that before we conclude this matter as a simple accident, we might do well to examine the library more thoroughly and to secure Jonathan's study pending a more complete investigation. There are certain aspects of the fall that warrant attention from someone with experience in such matters." Constable Hartley, who possessed enough sense to recognize when a medical professional was suggesting that his initial judgment might benefit from additional deliberation, agreed to this proposal with reasonable grace, though Miss Marple could observe the frustration evident in his bearing, the sense that he had been prepared to resolve a matter satisfactorily, and was now being asked to complicate it unnecessarily. As servants were sent to prepare Jonathan's study and to ensure that the library remained undisturbed pending further examination, Miss Marple rose from her chair with the careful movements of someone whose joints required consideration, and she expressed her intention to retire to her small guest room for the evening. Mrs. Hartwell had prepared a room for her, she explained, understanding that, as one of the village's most respected residents, she might wish to remain at the manor to assist with any further inquiries that might arise. This statement, which appeared reasonable on its surface, concealed a more calculating intention, for Miss Marple understood that the most revealing conversations in a household touched by sudden death often occurred in the hours after official visitors had departed, when people relaxed their careful guards and spoke more freely among themselves. She had positioned herself quite deliberately in a location where she might observe the interactions between the household members without drawing particular attention to her presence, and as she climbed the grand staircase toward the guest corridor, she carried with her the first, genuine threads of understanding concerning what had troll. Why occurred in Jonathan Ashford's library on that autumn afternoon. The guest room to which Miss Marple had been shown occupied a corner position on the second floor of Ashford Manor, a location that proved remarkably advantageous for a woman whose primary interest lay in observing the patterns of human behavior within the household. The room itself was appointed with the comfortable elegance typical of country manor guest accommodation, featuring a 4-poster bed draped in heavy damask, a writing desk positioned near the window, and a small sitting area that offered views across the front drive and toward the village beyond. But Miss Marple's attention was not particularly directed toward these comfortable furnishings. Rather, she had positioned herself in the armchair near the window where she could observe, through the open door into the corridor, the movements of household members as they passed to and from their various rooms. She had dressed for bed in a sensible nightgown of grey wool, her grey hair arranged in the neat pins that suggested no vanity whatsoever, and she sat with a small piece of needlework on her lap, a posture that would appear entirely innocent to anyone who might glimpse her through the doorway. The manor had settled into the particular quietness that follows an evening of disturbance. Yet Miss Marple detected beneath this surface calm a distinct undercurrent of tension, a sense that several people within the household remained wakeful despite the late hour, occupied with thoughts that kept sleep at bay. She had not been waiting long when she observed Margaret Ashford emerge from her suite of rooms, still dressed though with certain elements of her careful appearance somewhat loosened, suggesting that she had changed from her afternoon garments into something more private and comfortable. Margaret moved down the corridor toward Jonathan's stud, with the determined gait of someone on a specific mission, rather than the uncertain wandering of a grieving sister seeking solace, and Miss Marple's interest sharpened considerably as she observed this nocturnal excursion. The old lady's fingers continued their mechanical work with the needlework, maintaining the appearance of absorbed concentration while her mind engaged in the far more complex task of cataloguing and analyzing what she was witnessing. Margaret remained within the study for approximately 8 minutes, a period that seemed unusually extended for a simple moment of private reflection, and when she emerged, Miss Marple could observe that she was clutching several papers against her chest in a manner that suggested both satisfaction and anxiety. The younger woman had scarcely returned to her room when Eleanor appeared in the corridor, her dressing gown hastily tied, and her hair loosened from its careful afternoon arrangement, and Eleanor too proceeded directly to Jonathan's study with the purposefulness of someone following a predetermined plan. Eleanor's visit extended to nearly 12 minutes. A duration that suggested considerably more thorough investigation than her sister-in-law's quick excursion, and when she finally emerged, her expression carried a complexity of emotions that suggested she had discovered something of significance to her understanding of events. Miss Marple observed Eleanor pause outside her room, apparently engaged in some internal debate, before making an unexpected decision and proceeding instead toward the back staircase that led to the servants' quarters, a choice that suggested communication with someone outside the main household hierarchy. Having allowed sufficient time for Eleanor's movements to carry her out of sight, Miss Marple set aside her needlework and rose from her chair with the careful deliberation of someone whose physical form required consideration despite her mental acuity. She moved through the corridor with the practiced quietness of age, a quality that sometimes resulted from necessity rather than choice when joints protested movement with audible discomfort, and she made her own way to Jonathan's study to examine what had so occupied both Margaret and Eleanor during their nocturnal visits. The study was precisely as it had been left when Constable Hartley had sealed it pending further investigation, yet Miss Marple noted with interest that the seal consisted of nothing more than a constable's verbal instruction to the household staff not to disturb the room, a prohibition that clearly had not prevented both women from accessing the space and potentially removing or examining documents. The desk itself presented the most obvious location for Jonathan's research materials, and Miss Marple could observe the indentations in the blotter that suggested papers had been removed, along with certain dust patterns on the desktop that indicated items had been relocated. Jonathan's appointment book lay open on the desk, and Miss Marple read with considerable interest the entries for the days preceding his death, noting with particular attention an appointment marked simply as EP 3 o'clock on the previous afternoon, an entry that seemed to correspond with Eleanor's presence in the manor on that day. A series of architectural drawings remained stacked on the side table, and beneath these Miss Marple discovered something considerably more interesting, a carbon copy of a letter addressed to a solicitor in the neighboring town dated 3 days prior, in which Jonathan had expressed his intention to alter his will and to make certain financial arrangements regarding properties held jointly with Margaret. The letter had been begun but not completed, the final page missing in tier. Ely and Miss Marple understood that this missing page represented precisely the sort of document that both Margaret and Eleanor would have found of considerable interest during their secret visits to the study. She had not been examining these materials for more than a few minutes when she heard footsteps approaching down the corridor, and with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent a considerable portion of her life moving through the world without drawing undue attention, Miss Marple quietly returned the documents to their approximate original positions and moved herself into the deep shadows of the room, positioning herself behind the heavy velvet curtains that framed the window overlooking the library terrace. It was Dr. Graves who entered the study, his expression troubled and his bearing suggesting that sleep had proven as elusive for him as it apparently had for several other members of the household. He moved directly to the desk, as though he had some specific destination in mind, and began to examine the documents with the focused attention of someone searching for particular information. Miss Marple watched from her place of concealment as the doctor's expression shifted from puzzlement to a kind of dawning comprehension, and she observed with considerable interest as he withdrew something from his pocket, compared it carefully with items on the desk, and then returned the object to his pocket with movements that suggested profound internal conflict. Dr. Graves remained in the study for several additional minutes, his movements becoming increasingly agitated as he moved from the desk to the bookshelves that lined the eastern wall, running his fingers along the spines of architectural volumes and medical texts in a manner that suggested he was searching for something specific rather than engaging in casual browsing. Miss Marple, maintaining her position behind the curtains, observed with the patient attention of someone who understood that the true nature of a mystery often revealed itself not through obvious clues but through the behavior of those who possessed guilty knowledge. The doctor's hands trembled slightly as he withdrew a particular volume bound in dark leather, its title too distant for Miss Marple to read clearly, and he opened it with the reverent care one might employ when handling something of considerable fragility. What appeared to emerge from between the pages was a collection of photographs, old and yellowed with age, their subjects and details obscured from Miss Marple's vantage point, but clearly of profound significance to Dr. Graves, whose face had gone pale in the dim lamplight of the study. He stood for a long moment, photographs held in his shaking hands, and Miss Marple could observe the internal struggle manifest in his posture, the conflict between some compulsion to destroy or conceal these images and a recognition that such action might prove more damaging than exposure. Finally, with movements that suggested considerable reluctance, Dr. Graves replaced the photographs within the volume, returned the book to its position on the shelf, and departed the study with the bearing of someone who had made a decision that brought him neither satisfaction nor peace. Miss Marple waited a considerable time before emerging from her place of concealment, allowing sufficient interval to ensure that the doctor had returned to his assigned room and that the household had settled once more into its uneasy quiet. When she finally did venture from behind the curtains, her movements were slow and deliberate, those of a woman whose age and physical limitations required careful consideration rather than haste. She located the volume that Dr. Graves had examined with surprising ease, for the doctor had been sufficiently distracted to neglect returning it to its exact previous position, and she withdrew the photographs with the care one might employ when handling evidence of considerable importance. The images, though aged and somewhat deteriorated, told a story that began to illuminate the shadows that had surrounded Jonathan Ashford's return to the village and the circumstances that had led to his death on the library terrace. They showed a group of young people ranging in age from perhaps 16 to 25, gathered in what appeared to be the very study in which Miss Marple now stood, and their dating suggested they had been taken during the final months of the Second World War. Among the faces present, Miss Marple recognized several that remained familiar to her in their aged present forms. A young Dr. Graves, barely out of medical school and wearing the uniform of an army medical officer. A considerably younger Margaret Ashford, still bearing the soft features of youth, but with eyes that suggested worldliness beyond her apparent years, and most significantly, Jonathan Ashford himself, though in these images he appeared noticeably thinner and wore an expression of intensity that suggested circumstances far removed from the comfortable prosperity of his later years. But there were other faces present as well, individuals whose identities Miss Marple could not immediately place, though the formal arrangement of the group suggested it commemorated something of official significance. On the back of one of the photographs, written in a careful hand that Miss Marple recognized as Jonathan's own, were the words, "Ashford Manor, August 1944, the Resistance Network," a designation that suggested considerably more complexity to Jonathan's wartime activities than the official histories of his life had indicated. Miss Marple understood in that moment that the foundatio for Jonathan's death had been laid nearly 8 decades earlier, during those final months of the war when young men and women had engaged in activities that remained officially unacknowledged and personally dangerous. She replaced the photographs with meticulous care, ensuring that they remained in their concealment within the leather-bound volume, and she turned her attention to the other documents scattered across Jonathan's desk, examining the architectural drawings with a new understanding of what they might represent. The drawings themselves were recent, dated from within the past few months, and they showed modifications to the manor's structure that seemed unnecessarily elaborate for a man simply retiring to restore his childhood home to comfortable habitation. The proposed changes included the addition of a substantial basement extension, the modification of the eastern wing to include additional storage space, and most significantly, what appeared to be a concealed archive or vault system integrated into the library itself. Miss Marple understood with crystalline clarity that Jonathan had been engaged in far more than the simple nostalgia of returning to his native village. He had been undertaking a project of historical preservation, or perhaps historical concealment, and this project had brought him into direct conflict with individuals who preferred that certain wartime activities remain buried in the past, where they could no longer trouble the comfortable present. She descended the back staircase toward the servants' quarters, her nightgown rustling softly against the ancient stone steps, drawn by a compulsion to understand the full extent of the household's nocturnal activities. The servants' corridor was dimly lit by a single lamp, and Miss Marple observed light emanating from the small sitting room, typically reserved for the upper servants' evening hour. Relaxation. Through the partially open door, she could observe Eleanor in animated conversation with Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper, and the intensity of their discussion suggested a relationship far closer than the mere professional connection typically existing between mistress and household employee. Eleanor was showing Mrs. Hartwell something contained within a small wooden box, and the housekeeper's reaction suggested recognition and profound distress at whatever revelation the box contained. Miss Marple withdrew quietly from her position near the doorway, understanding that the conversation between Eleanor and Mrs. Hartwell possessed the kind of intimacy that suggested either a family connection or a shared secret of considerable magnitude, and she retraced her steps toward the guest corridor with the careful deliberation of a woman navigating both physical limitations and the necessity of maintaining her observation without detection. The manor had settled into the particular darkness of deep night, that hour when most honest people slept and those occupied with troubling thoughts remained wakeful, and Miss Marple understood that the coming dawn would bring new complications to a situation that was already considerably more complex than Constable Hartley's initial assessment had suggested. She had reached her room when footsteps on the main staircase drew her attention, and she observed through the crack in her doorway as Charles Pemberton descended with the bearing of a man engaged in some urgent business. The estate manager carried with him a leather satchel, and his movements suggested both purpose and nervous haste, as though he were uncertain whether to proceed with whatever errand had drawn him from his room at such an hour. Charles moved directly toward the side entrance that led to the estate offices and groundskeeping facilities, a location that seemed an unusual destination at such an advanced hour, unless some matter of genuine urgency required his immediate attention. Miss Marple's curiosity, which had not diminished appreciably in her 80 years of life, compelled her to take the considerable liberty of following at a discreet distance, moving through the manor's corridors with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that observation often provided answers that direct inquiry could never supply. The groundskeeping cottage lay perhaps 200 yards from the manor house proper, a modest structure that provided housing for the head groundskeeper and storage facilities for the equipment necessary to maintain Ashford Manor's extensive gardens and grounds. The door to this cottage stood open when Miss Marple approached within observational distance, and she could discern through the window that Charles was engaged in conversation with a figure whose features remained obscured by the interior shadows. The voice that emerged from within the cottage was unmistakably that of Timothy Wickham, the young vicar, a presence at Ashford Manor that seemed considerably more intimate and purposeful than a simple pastoral call would have warranted. Their conversation, though indistinct, carried sufficient emotional intensity that Miss Marple could perceive the underlying current of distress and urgency that animated both men's discourse. She had positioned herself behind the substantial trunk of an ancient oak tree that provided both concealment and an adequate vantage point, and she remained there for several minutes, observing the body language and occasional phrases that drifted through the open cottage window. What emerged from this nocturnal observation was the distinct impression that Timothy and Charles were engaged in some form of coordination regarding the events of the day, a collaboration that suggested Neither man had been content to permit Constable Hartley's preliminary determination of accidental death to stand without some effort at influencing how the investigation might proceed. Charles eventually departed the cottage, carrying what appeared to be a considerably lighter satchel than the one he had brought, and the leather bag he clutched as he made his return journey to the manor seemed to contain considerably less substance, suggesting that whatever documents or materials he had delivered had remained at the cottage for reasons that Miss Marple could only speculate upon. She waited until Charles had disappeared into the manor before emerging from her place of concealment, and she permitted herself the considerable liberty of examining the groundskeeping cottage more directly, approaching with the careful steps of an elderly woman whose presence might be explained by simple confusion regarding the manor's layout. The cottage door remained open, and inside Miss Marple observed Timothy Wickham sitting at a small wooden table, the satchel's contents spread before him in what appeared to be methodical examination. The vicar's attention was so focused upon these materials that he failed to notice Miss Marple's entrance, and she thus possessed the opportunity to observe his expression of profound concentration and the occasional moment when his hand moved to his head in a gesture suggesting the weight of disturbing knowledge. The documents spread across the table appeared to include architectural drawings similar to those in Jonathan's study, along with what seemed to be correspondence of some official nature and several photographs that Timothy was examining with particular intensity. Most intriguingly, there appeared to be a map of the manor's grounds with certain locations marked in red ink, and Miss Marple understood that this map likely indicated the location of whatever Jonathan had been undertaking in his planned renovation project. She had observed sufficient to begin formulating the outline of what had truly occurred, though several crucial elements remained obscured by the fog of incomplete information and the question of precise motivation that must ultimately explain why a successful London businessman had returned to his native village only to die under circumstances that grew more suspicious the more thoroughly one examined them. Miss Marple was turning to depart the cottage when Timothy finally sensed her presence, his head coming up with a start that suggested genuine alarm, and his hand instinctively moving to conceal the documents upon the table. The expression on his face transformed within an instant from concentration to something considerably more guarded, and he rose from his chair with movements that suggested both surprise and calculation, assessing how to respond to the presence of an elderly woman who had no good reason to be visiting the groundskeeping cottage at such an hour, and who had almost certainly observed at least some portion of his examination of the documents. "Miss Marple," Timothy said, his voice adopting the carefully controlled tone of someone who had learned to project authority despite internal disturbance, "I confess I am somewhat surprised to encounter you at such an hour in this rather humble location. One might wonder what brings a guest of the manor to visit the groundskeeping facilities in the middle of the night." Miss Marple smiled with the gentle warmth of an elderly woman who possessed no particular agenda beyond friendly conversation, though her eyes behind her spectacles remained alert and observant, taking in every detail of Timothy's appearance and demeanor with the focused attention of someone cataloguing information for future reference. "My dear boy," she said, her voice carrying the affectionate tone one might employ when addressing a favorite nephew, "I confess I became rather confused regarding the manor's layout and found myself wandering somewhat. I observed the light in this cottage and thought I might inquire the direction back to the main residence. I do hope I have not interrupted anything of importance." The lie was delivered with such complete conviction and such apparent innocent befuddlement that Timothy appeared to accept it as genuine, though Miss Marple could observe the calculation in his eyes as he assessed whether this elderly woman truly had witnessed nothing of significance, or whether her apparent confusion concealed a considerably sharper understanding than her demeanor suggested. Timothy moved with studied casualness to gather the documents scattered across the table, placing them back into the satchel with movements that suggested practiced efficiency, though Miss Marple noticed that several sheets remained partially visible and that Timothy's haste resulted in certain details being left exposed to view. "Of course," Timothy said, gesturing toward the cottage door. With the courteous bearing of a man trained in the social graces of his position, I am simply conducting some research regarding the manor's historical significance. The architectural records are quite fascinating, and I thought I might examine them here where I would not disturb the household during this difficult night. I shall be delighted to escort you back to the main residence, Miss Marple. One would not wish you to become lost in the grounds." Their walk back to the manor passed in silence that seemed weighted with unspoken communication, and Miss Marple was acutely aware of Timothy's periodic glances in her direction, as though he were attempting to determine whether her confusion regarding the manor's layout was genuine or a carefully constructed performance. She maintained her appearance of elderly befuddlement throughout the journey, allowing him to believe that he had successfully navigated a potentially dangerous encounter through the simple expedience of assuming her incapacity for genuine observation. It was not until they had reached the manor's side entrance that Timothy addressed her directly with something that transcended the bounds of casual conversation. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice taking on a different quality, one that suggested genuine concern, rather than the careful courtesy he had employed at the cottage, "I wonder if you might consider that some matters are perhaps better left unexamined. Jonathan's death, while tragic, appears to have been an accident. The village would perhaps be better served by accepting that conclusion and allowing the man to be laid to rest with appropriate solemnity." The statement hung in the cool night air, and Miss Marple understood it for what it truly was, a warning delivered by a man who understood that she possessed observations that might threaten whatever arrangement had been constructed regarding the events of the previous day. She looked up at him with an expression of mild surprise, as though his statement had suggested something she had not previously considered. "How very thoughtful of you to be concerned for the village's well-being," she said gently. "I confess, however, that I have always believed that truth, however uncomfortable, is ultimately preferable to comforting falsehood. Do you not agree, Mr. Wickham?" Timothy's expression hardened slightly, and he seemed on the verge of responding with something considerably less courteous when they were interrupted by the appearance of Dr. Graves, who had emerged from the manor, carrying what appeared to be his medical bag and wearing an expression suggesting he had not yet retired to sleep. The doctor's presence seemed to restore Timothy to something approximating his clerical courtesy, and he made his excuses with polite efficiency, leaving Miss Marple in Dr. Graves's company, as though the doctor's appearance had somehow relieved him of further obligation toward the elderly guest. Dr. Graves observed Timothy's departure with an expression that suggested he understood considerably more regarding the vicar's late-night activities than Timothy perhaps realized, and he turned his attention to Miss Marple with the direct gaze of someone who had decided that evasion served no useful purpose. "Miss Marple," he said without preamble, "I suspect you have observed considerably more during this evening than most people would have credited. Possible in a woman of your age. I further suspect that you are beginning to understand that Jonathan's death was not the simple accident that Constable Hartley has determined it to be. I find myself in a position of considerable difficulty regarding certain matters that I have become aware of, matters that concern not merely Jonathan's death, but the lives and futures of people I have known for many years." Miss Marple regarded him with an expression of sympathetic understanding, and she gestured toward the terrace where the library windows remained dark against the night sky. "Perhaps," she suggested gently, "we might sit for a moment in conversation. I suspect that you have information that would be beneficial to share, and I believe I possess certain observations that might assist in clarifying matters that have troubled you considerably. Would you be willing to speak candidly, Doctor, regarding what you have discovered concerning Jonathan's wartime activities and the connection those activities bear to the circumstances of his death?" Dr. Graves hesitated for a moment, his medical bag held in one hand, while his other hand gripped the stone railing of the terrace with sufficient force to suggest the internal struggle between the professional confidentiality he had maintained throughout his career and the recognition that certain matters transcended the bounds of ordinary discretion. The October night air had turned decidedly colder, and Miss Marple observed that the doctor's breath had begun to mist slightly as he exhaled, a physical manifestation of the tension that gripped his frame. "You must understand," he finally said, his voice carrying the weight of secrets long maintained, "that during the war, particularly in the final years, certain activities were undertaken that were never officially acknowledged, and that many of those involved have maintained absolute silence regarding their nature and purpose. Jonathan was part of such a network, as was I, as were several others whose names remain known only to those who were directly involved. We were young, Miss Marple, and we believed we were engaged in work of supreme importance, work that might have altered the course of history had circumstances been different. They settled into the wicker chairs that had been positioned on the terrace for the convenience of the manor's inhabitants, and Dr. Graves began to recount, with the halting cadence of someone unused to discussing matters he had kept private for nearly 8 decades, the nature of Jonathan's wartime activities. The resistance network that had been established at Ashford Manor had not been a British operation, though it had operated with the tacit knowledge and occasional support of certain British military intelligence officials. Rather, it had been an operation designed to facilitate the escape of certain individuals deemed to be of particular value to the post-war reconstruction of Europe, individuals whose identities and current locations remained concealed behind layers of official denial and carefully constructed historical records. Jonathan, by virtue of his position as the eldest son of a substantial landholder and his demonstrated architectural abilities, had been recruited to assist in the creation of concealment systems within the manor, hidden spaces designed to shelter individuals during the final months of Nazi occupation and the chaos of liberation. The photographs that Miss Marple had discovered depicted members of this network, individuals who had been provided with false identities, documentation and passage to safety through a carefully constructed chain that extended from Ashford Manor through a series of safe houses to eventual emigration to various destinations throughout Europe and beyond. "The difficulty," Dr. Graves explained, his voice taking on a tone suggesting the burden that had accompanied the revelation, was that Jonathan never entirely released his involvement with these matters. He maintained records, detailed documentation of the network's operations, the identities of those who had been assisted, and the locations to which they had been relocated. He believed, quite earnestly, that this documentation represented a significant historical record that ought to be preserved, studied, and ultimately revealed to demonstrate the courage and sacrifice of those who had participated in the operation. Miss Marple listened with the patient attention of someone who understood that the full picture of events required comprehension of all the emotional and historical currents that underlay them. "And I suspect," she said gently, "that not everyone who had participated in these activities welcomed the prospect of Jonathan's historical documentation being made public. Some of those assisted individuals, I imagine, had constructed lives and identities that depended upon the complete secrecy of their wartime origins. Others, perhaps, had family members or professional associates who would find such revelation deeply embarrassing or damaging." Dr. Graves nodded slowly, his expression suggesting both relief at being understood and renewed distress at the implications of that understanding. "Precisely so," he said. "Jonathan wrote to me 3 weeks ago indicating his intention to commission a proper archive system to be constructed within the manor, a project for which he had already begun detailed architectural planning. He intended to house the historical documentation in a specially designed vault, climate-controlled and secure, and he was considering making arrangements in his will for the materials to be transferred to a university library after his death. He asked me to confirm that I possessed no objection to such an arrangement, and more directly, he asked me whether I believed that the individuals who had been assisted and protected should be informed of his intentions." The doctor's hands trembled slightly as he continued, and Miss Marple observed the toll that maintaining silence regarding these matters had exacted upon him. I advised him that proceeding with such documentation and public revelation would likely cause considerable distress and potential harm to individuals who had built lives based upon the confidentiality that had been promised to them. He listened politely to my concerns, but made clear his determination to proceed with the project regardless of the personal cost to any of us. He believed, Miss Marple, that historical truth superseded personal comfort, that the sacrifice made during the war years deserved to be acknowledged, even if that acknowledgement caused difficulties in the present. And so, Miss Marple said, though it was not truly a question but rather a statement of understanding, when Jonathan died yesterday afternoon, it was not because he fell accidentally from the library window while occupied with innocent contemplation, but because someone who feared the consequences of his historical project took action to prevent that project's completion. The question that now presents itself is not whether Jonathan's death was intentional, but rather which of the individuals currently within Ashford Manor felt sufficiently threatened by Jonathan's plans to resort to such a drastic measure. Dr. Graves met her gaze directly, and in his eyes Miss Marple perceived not merely acknowledgement, but a specific knowledge regarding the identity of the person responsible for Jonathan's death. Knowledge that the doctor possessed but remained reluctant to articulate, bound by the professional confidentiality and personal loyalty that had shaped his entire adult existence. The silence that followed Miss Marple's statement extended for a considerable interval, broken only by the distant sound of wind moving through the ancient trees that surrounded the manor, and the occasional rustle of nocturnal creatures disturbed by the presence of humans on the terrace at such an unseemly hour. Miss Marple understood that Dr. Graves possessed knowledge that professional ethics and personal loyalty prevented him from sharing directly, and she recognized that any attempt to press him for explicit confirmation would likely result in his withdrawal from the conversation altogether. Instead, she allowed her mind to organize and evaluate the information she had gathered throughout the long evening, sorting through observations and deductions with the methodical precision that had served her well throughout decades of observing human nature in its myriad manifestations. "Tell me," she said, adopting a tone of casual curiosity that suggested she was posing an idle question rather than one of profound significance regarding Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper. "How long has she served at Ashford Manor?" Dr. Graves's expression shifted subtly, though whether toward relief at the apparent change of subject or toward deeper anxiety regarding the direction of Miss Marple's inquiry remained ambiguous. "Mrs. Hartwell came to the manor approximately 6 months after the war ended," he said carefully. "She was engaged by Jonathan's mother to manage the household, and she has served the family with considerable loyalty ever since. She is a woman of exemplary character and discretion, well respected in the village, and devoted to the manor's operations and the well-being of those who reside within it." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, as though this information confirmed certain suspicions she had entertained. "And her connection to Eleanor, which I observed in the servants' quarter this evening, appears considerably more intimate than that which typically exists between employer and household employee. I wonder whether Mrs. Hartwell might perhaps be related to Eleanor by blood, rather than merely by employment arrangement." The question hung in the darkness, and Miss Marple observed Dr. Graves's shoulders tense in a manner suggesting she had touched upon a matter of considerable sensitivity. "Mrs. Hartwell is Eleanor's mother," the doctor said quietly, abandoning the careful circumlocution he had previously maintained. "Eleanor's father died during the war, and Eleanor's mother came to Ashford Manor to secure employment and to provide her daughter with respectable circumstances despite her widowed status. The relationship between Eleanor and her mother remained cordial but distant for many years, maintained with the proper distance that social convention dictated between employer and servant. However, recent circumstances have apparently prompted a closer connection between them. Recent circumstances being Eleanor's separation from her husband, Miss Marple suggested, and her return to the village seeking refuge and perhaps financial security. I observed Eleanor carrying what appeared to be a substantial wooden box during her conversation with her mother in the servants' quarter. I wonder what items that box might have contained." Dr. Graves rose from his chair with movements suggesting agitation and internal conflict, and he moved to the stone railing overlooking the library terrace where Jonathan's body had been discovered only hours earlier. His gaze seemed fixed upon the spot where the body had lain, and Miss Marple understood that the doctor was engaged in some form of internal debate regarding how much he should permit himself to articulate regarding matters he possessed considerable knowledge of. The box contained photographs, Dr. Graves finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Photographs taken during the war years, photographs that documented certain individuals who had been assisted by the resistance network. Eleanor discovered these photographs among Jonathan's private papers, and she removed them during her visit to his study this evening. Her mother, Mrs. Hartwell, recognized the individuals depicted in those photographs as people who had been her friends before the war, people whose faces she had not seen for nearly 8 decades. Miss Marple understood in that moment the full complexity of the human drama that had unfolded at Ashford Manor, a narrative woven from threads of wartime loyalty, post-war survival, personal connection, and the collision between historical truth and individual privacy. Mrs. Hartwell, who had arrived at the manor ostensibly as a servant seeking employment, had actually been one of the individuals assisted by the resistance network, someone whose identity had been reconstructed and whose past had been carefully buried beneath layers of assumption and propriety. Eleanor's discovery of the photographs had revealed to her mother the opportunity to reconnect with a past she had been forced to abandon, and the emotional significance of this reunion had apparently motivated Eleanor to remove the photographs to prevent Jonathan's intended historical documentation from making that past publicly known. But this does not explain, Miss Marple said carefully, why Jonathan died. The removal of photographs, however emotionally significant to Eleanor and her mother, does not constitute sufficient motive for murder. There must be something more, something that threatened not merely Eleanor and Mrs. Hartwell, but someone else as well, someone whose identity or position or future circumstance would be jeopardized by Jonathan's historical project. Dr. Graves turned from the railing to face Miss Marple directly, and his expression suggested he had reached some form of decision regarding how much truth he would permit himself to acknowledge. Margaret Ashford, he said, and the word seemed to emerge from him with considerable effort, was not in fact Jonathan's biological sister. She was one of the individuals assisted by the resistance network, a young woman whose original identity and family were lost to the war, whose past was constructed entirely through false documentation and careful placement within the Ashford household. Jonathan's mother took her in as a foundling of distant relation, and over the years, Margaret became recognized as a legitimate member of the family. However, Jonathan's historical documentation would reveal the truth regarding her origins, a truth that would destroy the social position she has maintained for nearly 8 decades and would invalidate the inheritance arrangements she believed to be secure. Margaret visited Jonathan's study this evening not merely to examine documents, but to search for evidence of his intentions regarding the historical archive and the contents it would contain. Miss Marple sat in contemplative silence for a long moment, her small hands folded in her lap, and her gaze fixed upon the dark library window where Jonathan Ashford had met his end. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to arrange themselves into a coherent picture, yet certain elements remained unclear. Certain motivations and actions required additional examination before the complete truth could be articulated with the certainty that justice demanded. "You have told me," she said slowly, "that Margaret discovered Jonathan's intentions and visited his study to examine the extent of his documentation. You have indicated that Mrs. Hartwell, LL and Eleanor removed certain photographs to prevent revelation of their identities. You have suggested that Timothy Wickham and Charles Pemberton are engaged in some form of coordination regarding how the investigation into Jonathan's death should proceed. Yet none of these actions constitute sufficient motive for murder unless there exists some additional element, some circumstance that elevated the threat posed by Jonathan's historical project from mere personal embarrassment to something considerably more dire." Dr. Graves's face had taken on the pallor of a man who had finally reached the point of complete disclosure, and he returned to his chair with movements suggesting physical exhaustion. "Timothy Wickham," he said with evident difficulty, "is not in fact the grandson of the vicar who served St. Mary's during the war years. Timothy is the son of one of the individuals assisted by the resistance network, a child born in 1945 to a woman who was herself one of those protected by the network. Timothy's mother was a young German woman who had been instrumental in the operation's success, and she was removed from Europe with false documentation stating she was Austrian rather than German. She settled in this country, married, and gave birth to Timothy, but her true origins remained hidden. When Timothy discovered Jonathan's intentions regarding the historical documentation, he understood that revelation of his mother's true identity and wartime role might expose her to considerable legal and social jeopardy, regardless of the decades that have passed since the war's conclusion. And Charles Pemberton, Miss Marple continued, understanding now the full scope of the conspiracy, possesses his own connection to the resistance network. He too was someone whose identity had been reconstructed, whose past had been carefully concealed. Jonathan's threat to reveal these identities united several individuals in a shared recognition that his historical project must be prevented at any cost. Dr. Graves nodded slowly, his expression suggesting both acknowledgement and profound sorrow at the revelations that had been forced from him. Charles and Timothy discussed matters extensively, he said. I did not know of their coordination until late yesterday afternoon when I encountered them in conversation near the library. They were debating how to approach Jonathan, what arguments might persuade him to abandon his project. Charles mentioned that if Jonathan could not be persuaded through reason or appeal to compassion regarding the consequences of revelation, then other measures might become necessary. I did not fully comprehend his meaning at that moment, but as events have unfolded, I have come to understand what he may have intended. But Charles did not kill Jonathan, Miss Marple said with certainty. The sequence of events you have described, combined with my own observations regarding Charles's movements and his emotional state, suggests that he was not the person responsible for Jonathan's death. Rather, I suspect that Charles and Timothy had engaged in their discussion, that Charles had perhaps made veiled references to the possibility of preventing Jonathan's project through means other than persuasion, and that, when Jonathan died in a manner that appeared to be accidental, both men understood that someone else had taken action they had only contemplated in theory. She rose from her chair with the deliberate movements of age, and she moved to stand beside Dr. Graves at the railing overlooking the library terrace. I believe, she said quietly, that Margaret Ashford is responsible for Jonathan's death. The motive appears clear. Jonathan's historical project threatened to expose her identity as someone who had been assisted by the resistance network, rather than a legitimate member of the Ashford family. The inheritance she believed to be secure would be placed in jeopardy, and her social position within the village would be destroyed. More significantly, there may exist legal complications regarding property and assets that were transferred to her based upon false presumptions regarding her lineage. Dr. Graves made no immediate response, but his shoulders seemed to contract as though the weight of acknowledged truth had settled upon them with physical force. The question that remains, Miss Marple continued, is precisely how Margaret accomplished the deed. A fall from the library window would require considerable force to be fatal if the victim retained consciousness and the capacity to resist. Jonathan was a physically healthy man, and he would not have surrendered himself to such a fate without struggle. Yet the evidence at the scene suggested no indication of violent confrontation or resistance. I observed that the flowers and vegetation beneath the window were arranged in a manner suggesting deliberate rearrangement, and I noted the absence of the kind of chaotic disturbance that would accompany a genuine accidental fall. Miss Marple turned to face Dr. Graves directly, and in her expression he perceived the clarity of understanding that came from decades of observing human nature. Jonathan was not killed by a fall from the library window, she said with absolute certainty. He was killed elsewhere, by means that required neither struggle nor resistance, and his body was subsequently arranged upon the terrace to suggest the appearance of accidental death. I suspect that the reading lamp found broken beneath the window was deliberately positioned to suggest that Jonathan had knocked it over during his fall, and that the timing of Charles Pemberton's discovery was carefully orchestrated to ensure that the body would be found before rigor mortis and other physical evidence could definitively establish the time of death. The old lady's voice carried the weight of accumulated wisdom and understanding. What I require now, she said, is your confirmation regarding the method by which Margaret accomplished this deed. For I believe, Dr. Graves, that the instrument of Jonathan's death may well be something within your professional purview, something that you recognized when you examined the body yesterday, and something that has caused you considerable distress throughout this endless night." The morning sun had begun its ascent over the eastern horizon when Miss Marple and Dr. Graves returned to Ashford Manor, casting long shadows across the gravel drive and illuminating the manor's stone facade with the golden light of a new day that seemed indifferent to the tragedies that had unfolded within its walls. The household was already stirring, servants moving about their morning duties with the subdued efficiency of people attempting to maintain normalcy in the face of disruption, and Mrs. Hartwell herself appeared in the entrance hall as Miss Marple and the doctor crossed the threshold, her expression suggesting she had not slept during the night and possessed some intuitive awareness that events were about to reach some form of conclusion. Constable Hartley arrived at the manor approximately an hour after Miss Marple had conveyed to him, with Dr. Graves's professional support, the necessity of conducting a thorough toxicological examination of Jonathan's body and a more detailed investigation into the circumstances surrounding his death. The constable's initial resistance to reopening the matter quickly dissolved when confronted with the combined weight of Dr. Graves's medical expertise and Miss Marple's observations regarding the inconsistencies in the fizz. "Ecal evidence." She described with careful precision the arrangement of the flowers and vegetation beneath the library window, the position of Jonathan's body, which suggested it had been placed rather than fallen naturally, and the absence of the kind of injuries that would accompany a genuine fall from such a height. By the time Dr. Graves mentioned the missing digitalis from his medical bag and described the specific symptoms of cardiac glycoside poisoning that he had observed upon the body, Constable Hartley's expression had shifted from skepticism to grim acknowledgement that a far more serious investigation was required than his initial assessment had suggested. It was Margaret Ashford who requested an audience with Constable Hartley late in the morning, a summons that brought the constable and Miss Marple to the drawing room, where Margaret sat with the composed bearing of someone who had reached some form of internal resolution regarding the manner in which she would face the consequences of her actions. The elderly woman's hands remained steady as she spoke, though her voice carried the weight of a life lived under the assumption of false identity, finally confronting the reality that deception could not be maintained indefinitely. "I administered the digitalis to Jonathan's tea yesterday afternoon," Margaret said without preamble, dispensing with the circumlocution that most people would have employed in such circumstances. "I obtained it from Dr. Graves's medical bag, which he had left unattended in the morning room during his visit to attend to Father's old condition. Jonathan had invited me to take tea with him in the library at 3 o'clock, and I arrived with the intention of attempting once more to persuade him to abandon his historical project. When he refused, when he made clear that the publication of his historical documentation was inevitable and that no personal consideration would dissuade him, I acted." She paused, and in that pause Miss Marple perceived the full weight of Margaret's recognition of what her action had meant. "I had prepared the digitalis solution in advance," Margaret continued, "and when Jonathan was momentarily occupied with adjusting the window, I added it to his tea. He drank without suspicion, and within minutes the effects began to manifest. His breathing became labored, his heart rate accelerated, and then became irregular. He reached for me, attempted to speak, but the poison had already done its work. I moved him to the terrace and arranged the scene to suggest that he had fallen. I positioned the lamp beneath the window and disturbed the vegetation to create the appearance of accidental death. Charles discovered him as I intended he should, at the moment when the body still retained sufficient warmth to suggest recent death, but when the toxicological evidence would be obscured by the apparent violence of the fall." Constable Hartley's expression hardened into the professional detachment of a law enforcement officer confronted with a confession of homicide, and he moved to arrest Margaret with the formality that his position required. Yet as he did so, Margaret Ashford rose with dignity, her small frame straightening as though the removal of the burden of deception had somehow restored to her the capacity to face her future with composure. "I am not ashamed of what I have done," she said, addressing not merely Constable Hartley but Miss Marple and the gathered household members who had assembled in the hall upon learning that matters had reached their conclusion. I spent 80 years constructing an identity that was entirely false, living a life based upon lies and concealment. That identity was to me more real and more precious than any truth could have been, and the prospect of Losi. It seemed to me to justify any action. I do not ask for forgiveness or for understanding. I ask only that people recognize the desperation of someone whose entire existence was built upon a foundation of deception, suddenly facing the prospect of exposure and annihilation. As Margaret was led away by Constable Hartley, Timothy Wickham and Charles Pemberton emerged from the morning room where they had been maintaining anxious vigil regarding the outcome of the investigation. Timothy's expression reflected the complicated emotions of someone who had contemplated murder as a theoretical possibility, yet been relieved to discover that someone else had taken the action he had only discussed. Charles moved immediately to speak with Mrs. Hartwell, and Miss Marple observed the subtle communication that passed between them, a recognition that certain secrets had been preserved, and that the Resistance Network's historical records would remain concealed, protected by the removal of Jonathan and the prevention of his historical documentation project. By late afternoon, Ashford Manor had begun to return to something approximating its normal operations, though the shadow of Jonathan's death and Margaret's arrest lingered like an unwelcome guest that could not quite be persuaded to depart. Miss Marple sat in the library, the precise location where Jonathan had met his end, and she reflected upon the complex interplay of wartime loyalty, post-war survival, personal identity, and the terrible choices that individuals faced when confronted with the prospect of losing everything they had constructed over decades of careful deception. Dr. Graves joined her as the evening shadows began to lengthen across the grounds, and they sat together in companionable silence, two people who understood that justice and compassion were not always perfectly aligned, and that sometimes the resolution of mysteries revealed not merely the guilt of the perpetrator, but the profound fragility of human identity and the desperate measures to which people might resort when faced with annihilation. The village of St. Mary's would recover from this disruption, would mourn Jonathan Ashford and eventually lay him to rest with appropriate solemnity, and would gradually reconstruct the comfortable normalcy that had been interrupted by his death. Yet for those who had participated in the events of these few extraordinary days, the recognition that tragedy and desperation could motivate even the most unlikely among them to commit acts of violence would remain as an uncomfortable truth that could never quite be forgotten, no matter how much time passed or how thoroughly life attempted to return to its ordinary rhythms.